amidst the HIV scare to head the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation HIV prevention operations in India. In motivating sex workers to organize themselves to protect themselves as a sustainable long-term solution, he observed that they had sharper and wider leadership qualities than the white-collared management segments in the corporate world. And the decision-making and negotiating skills of the sex workers walked the edge of survival on a daily basis. Amrit Dhillon has joined Ashok Alexander for us to hear about his first-hand experiences and his book, The Child of His 10-Year-Old Labor of Love, with the most successful HIV prevention program in India. Amrit Dhillon is a reporter for Guardian and The Times in UK, as also with other international publications.
Thank you. Hello Kasoli, hello everyone. It's my first time at this festival, so I'm hoping to have a good time. I'm very pleased to be here because I'm going to be interviewing Ashok about his marvelous book. I'm going to keep my comments short because you've come to hear him, not me. But I want to say one or two things about the book. The first thing about this book that struck me when I wrote about it for The Guardian is that it's an amazing account of one man's personal journey into the unknown. Ashok was with McKinsey and Company. He'd been there 17 years. He was in his late 40s and he was at the top of his game, talking to CEOs about how to fix the problems of large corporations. I'm sure Ashok thought that he was going to retire from McKinsey. Then the Gates Foundation came and they decided to launch the India office to fight what everyone thought was going to be an AIDS epidemic in India. They chose Ashok to head the campaign. Now, what a choice this was for Ashok to make, to give up everything he knew, to give up his career at McKinsey, and to throw himself completely outside his comfort zone into something he, at that time, knew nothing about. The other thing that struck me about the book when I wrote about it for The Guardian is that it's extremely well written and it's a compelling read. If any of you in this room think this book is a dry tome on a public health project full of boring tables and facts and statistics, let me tell you, you couldn't be more wrong. This book is packed with people, relationships, tragedy, pathos, humor, all of it. And from the word go, from his brilliant opening line, that's the kind of roller coaster read that you're going to have. One last thing about it before I open it up to talking to Ashok is that this is an important book. It's an account of one of India's biggest public health achievements, conquering AIDS with the help of the country's sex workers. It's not been written about a great deal. It's not been celebrated. It's not an achievement that many people know anything about. And that's a pity. If we were talking about TB or polio, this would have been a success that everyone would have wanted to own. Everyone says that failure has no owners. Success has so many. This is a success that no one has really talked about. And the reason is simple. The reason is that there's still a stigma attached to AIDS and to sex work. I'm going to start by asking Ashok the obvious question. Ashok, why did you give up your life of fine dining, champagne lunches, and mixing with the smartest men and women in the corporate world to enter a world of sex work and truckers? But was it a midlife crisis, or do you have more solid reasons?
start with the last part of what you said. I was mixing with the people a lot smarter than corporate leaders, which is namely garden variety sex workers all around India. So that was obvious. But I don't want to get into this. It's a very complex thing. If I were to analyze it briefly, I would say, if someone comes along and says, why don't you leave what you're doing? We'll give you a chance to work on an epidemic which threatens India. You'd have to be a pretty stupid guy to say, no, I want to go and do the next progress review for my client. So it was compelling. It just grabbed me by the throat. Second, it was an adventure. You didn't know where it would end up, so that was fun. And third, maybe, I won't say midlife crisis, but there was some kind of restlessness inside me at the age of whatever I was in my 40s, but I think can happen to a person at any age, 20 or 70 or 80. It's a restlessness which most of us push aside, and I realized I wanted to answer that. So these things all came together. But I want to say one thing. By now the book's been there for a year. I've done many of these sessions, and I've come to understand when you say the word sex work, it means different things to different people. For some people, most terribly, it means having seen the movie Pretty Woman. For others, it's images of brothels in India. But what I came to understand is that it is something else. It is another India. It's a completely different India. I refer to it as a third India. It's not even the kind of poverty that I was used to seeing. It was a desperate place. So I can't explain that well enough in words. I want to read. This is the only passage I'll inflict on you from my book in this whole afternoon. And it's only 30 seconds long. I'll read that passage, and then I want to show some pictures from my field trips, which will last 3.5 minutes, and then we'll get on with our conversation. You look disapproving. But so, you know, when I left McKinsey, I had some notions that this was another management consulting advice project where I would get the data, put it in a framework, and get around to working on AIDS. But I thought I was taking up a new career. I didn't expect I would also be plunged into an adventure that was both bewildering and exhilarating. It led me to visit places and get to know people I'd never imagined existed. It was an India that fell outside the comfort zones I had lived and worked in all my life. It went beyond the brief encounters with poverty I had seen from so many windows. It was a grinding place where women would sell themselves for 50 rupees and 14-year-olds injected drugs. It was the secret world of transgender people and the agony of young gay men in a country that still criminalized same-sex love. It was the strange world of truckers, lonely journeymen along forgotten highways. It also often turned out to be a place of spectacular natural beauty. It was above all a place where heroic battles for a barely decent life were being fought every day. So this was not anything that I had even imagined could exist. And that was an India where, frankly, perhaps 1/3 of our citizens are living every day. So let me show you some pictures and then we'll get on with the discussion. And Shweta, if you just roll these are just photographs.
Sure, ma'am.
Getting in the way of the pictures? No.
for Avahan, as it was called, the program?
I already told you that.
In a bit more detail.
Well, it's too short a session for me to try and explain why I did that. Let's just say it was an offer I couldn't refuse. Maybe I can talk about what it did to me.
Okay.
I think that the first time I got exposed to this other India, it was a sense of shock that so many of our fellow citizens were living this way, and just to move on with that. I think that shock, you often say it got over that shock, but that shock led to something that I would say was akin to a feeling of devastation, that I couldn't handle this problem. It was a very personal feeling that I, this professional problem solver, had no clue as to how to solve an issue like this. Because sex workers were not using condoms because they weren't aware of it. The sex worker would tell me, "You're trying to teach a trucker how to use about tires. I know all about condoms. The reason I don't use condoms, why didn't you ask me that?" And so we were stuck with, that was a question I couldn't quite know, how do you deal with that? They were dealing with violence. So this notion of helplessness was a feeling of devastation. And then as you go through the book where I've told the whole story, it gave way to a sense of hope and progress and satisfaction. I'm not saying this to blow smoke at myself, as they say, but the Lancet eventually credited the movement with having averted more than 600,000 infections and having made a contribution. And the reason I say this is not because of the person sitting here. This entire book and its title says, it is a story of the power of women coming together in groups. And I might add, the more marginalized, there's nothing more terrible perhaps than for a woman to have to take to sex work just to make sure her child gets some milk or some food or some medicine or the cost of her next meal. It was these women coming together who solved such a complex public health problem. That is the purpose of this book. I only got the opportunity to kind of hang around and be with them. And that's remarkable. That is the stranger truth that I referred to in the title of the book.
Glad you mentioned the number of infections that were averted, because we forget today, when you look at the reports that came out around 2002, 2003, the predictions were horrifying. They were that India was going to become the AIDS capital of the world. There were about, how many? Over 2 million AIDS orphans at that time, a figure that was going to multiply exponentially. And the talk was that AIDS, the AIDS epidemic, was going to ravage India, ravage the economy, society, families, relationships. So the fact that this didn't come to pass is a great achievement, both of the foundation and of obviously other efforts. So since you were thrown into the deep end, not knowing anything about the nature of the problem or what the possible solutions might be, how did you deal with the first 6 months, first year or so?
Well, I think it's always useful in public health to go out into the field. So we had set a norm for ourselves. For me, it was 4 days a week in the field. For the rest of the team, it was 5 days a week in the field. So we just lived in the field. And when I'm talking about field, I think I'm beloved of sex workers all over India like no man can ever be. Because I was visiting brothels and visiting places of sex work, commercial sex, from Manipur, Nagaland, down to Karnataka, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, 6 states. I covered 80 out of 82 districts, and I regret that I didn't cover those two. So that is the one thing I did. That gave me some insight as to what I didn't know, and what the questions that I didn't have the answer to. And then I learned something else which I never ever knew in McKinsey, which is something called humility. And I didn't have a trace of that. If any of you know McKinsey and Company, it's not a place where they teach you humility. So I kind of found certain words coming out of my mouth for which I would have been definitely fired very quickly if I said that to a client, which is, I don't know the answer to this. What do you think we should do? And that's when the sex workers started giving solutions which are simple and compelling. And they said, simple, we have to deal with violence. And I would say, explain that to me. Why is violence related to condom use? And they would explain that every commercial sex transaction involves violence, almost everyone. The client doesn't want to use a condom. She insists he use a condom. She pleads with him. She's slapped, she's burnt, she may be stabbed. If you can treat the violence, you improve condom usage at scale. So how do you treat the violence? And that's another story, that's the story of the book. It's about women coming together in groups. But I might add this here, a little bit of my own training came in, using hard data. Hard data, because you can't go back and wave your hands and say, we prevent a lot of infections. So that's where these numbers and estimates started coming out. So I was able to use a little bit of my skill, but I was able to grow a lot. I like to think. I was perhaps a fairly shallow human being coming into it. I became less shallow over the course of this whole journey.
I can vouch for the fact that McKinsey consultants are not known for their humility. I worked there for a while, and they, all of them, from the moment
don't go down that route.
No, they strut around like masters of the universe, as though they know the answer to every problem. So that must have been a real difficulty for you, Ashok, initially. But you said that elements of your McKinsey approach were important, such as the use of hard data. Were there any, the typical McKinsey approach to a problem is to go in, disaggregate it, analyze it, get the stakeholders on board, get the solution, go in and implement it. Was there any aspect of this classical approach that you were familiar with that you used with Abraham?
Yeah, definitely, but let me give a little context to this. We normally think of sex work, you have a picture of a brothel. Actually, brothelized sex, as it's called, is about 6% of total sex work in India. You see those brothels, large brothels only exist in Mumbai, Delhi, there's Sonagachi in Calcutta and Budwarpet in Pune, about 4 or 5 cities. Most commercial sex is invisible. It's on the streets, it's being practiced everywhere. It's in homes, it's hidden. The average housewife that you see, lower middle class, may be a sex worker. These are the truths of the whole thing. The reason I'm mentioning this is that yes, the McKinsey consultant can go and say, let me estimate the market and then segment it. But what if the consumer is invisible? What if the consumer is moving, because sex workers are continuously migrant? What if when you found her, she told you what the lady told me, I don't want your product? Now that's a problem that McKinsey never taught us to solve. But yet, the crux of it is data use. If you look at it as a business person, the crux of it. And public health programs were not using data. They would say, we distributed so many condoms. They would never say, how many condoms do we need to distribute? And so on and so forth. So some of my stuff did come into it, and the aspects like we ran a huge organization. My team was never more than 15 people, but we had 8,500 sex workers. We had the largest army of sex workers working on this, male and female and transgender, and throw in a whole bunch of injection drug users and quite a few truckers also in the process. By the way, I want to say something which I'm a little sensitive about. You didn't ask the question, but can I say that? Which is this, that some people tell me, how could you write such a depressing book? And I say, have you actually read the book? And the surprising answer is no, actually we haven't, we're planning to, but a book on HIV/AIDS must be a turn-off. Let me say that I like to think that this is a book that has nothing to do with HIV. You can take HIV out of that and say, disease condition next. It's a story of women and a story of human beings. And I like to think that yes, there is tragedy there, but I like to think there's some humor there, there's some pathos there, some characters there, that people can cry, but they can be angry and they can laugh a lot reading this book.
There's nothing grim or depressing about it at all, I can say, having read it, because the stories of the women and how they're coping with their lives with absolutely nothing going for them is inspiring. But you talk about that, Ashok, you talk about leadership you're familiar with. You're dealing with CEOs all the time at McKinsey. But you say in the book that you found a lot of unexpected leadership skills in the sex workers that you worked with. What kind of skills? I know you've talked about courage and humor.
I would say I have a chapter in the book called Leadership Secrets of the Commercial Sex Worker. And people think that I'm being facetious when I've written this book, but I had the chance over a long period in McKinsey to work with some of the most famous names in India, corporate leaders. I can tell you with absolute certainty that any scores of sex workers that I've met all over India would outdo any of these fancy names that I've dealt with. And without exception, I'm not going to call out names, but I can't think of a corporate leader in India who would match several of the sex workers I can bring in front of them. Why do I say that? Look at the attributes sex workers have. They have commercial intelligence. They have great charisma. They know subtleties like how to use a sense of humor to win a negotiation or to defuse a difficult situation. The list goes on and on. A corporate leader can have just one or two shots in his game. He can be a complete jerk but a great negotiator. He can be a tremendous negotiator and winner of new business, but be unable to build coalitions around him. The reason corporate leaders can do that is because they have people covering for them. Think of any famous name, you'll find whether it's a Steve Jobs or someone else. They were terrible at certain things. Sex workers don't have that luxury. They have to have that entire repertoire of 7 or 8 leadership skills. And if they miss one of them, it can be a life or death issue. If she doesn't know how to diffuse that situation of violence by using 4 or 5 subtle techniques, using a sense of humor, putting it in a certain way to the client, with great subtlety, if she doesn't diffuse that, she might get worse than a beating. She might get infected with HIV. So that is leadership of her.
And being a good judge of character, instant judge of character.
You know, I make the point in the book that a sex worker can judge a man at 20 to 30 feet. I'm not exaggerating. She can see a guy. I'm not pointing at you, sir. I'm just. She can. Whatever. So they can point to some man out there and say, "This is not the guy I would want to deal with today." And when we would go in, when the sex worker sizes you up instantaneously, usually after you've spoken to her for 30 seconds, she's got you figured out. And then there's an element of everything that you and I feel is heightened for them. There's an intensity of trust that comes about. And because her life is very short on time is money, literally, they will converse and communicate a lot in a half a minute that will take a long time, if this makes sense in other conversations. So I was learning these techniques and saying, wow, and I was also being inspired in a way which was like, I can't describe. I mean, I've carried that feeling through and felt quite often that I was the luckiest guy in the world when I got this opportunity. So when you say, why did you do it? I said, what can I say?
Yeah. But having done the work, having done the great job for 10 years, scaled it up, had the results that you had, what made you feel that you wanted to share the story? Why write the book?
I'll tell you exactly why. Because when I came back to my hotel room in the evening, I would say to myself sometimes, did that really happen today? I mean, these situations were so unbelievable, some of them, sometimes so funny, that I started saying, and my dad had inculcated this habit that you must keep a diary, but I started saying, I will write a diary. Without that diary, I couldn't have written this book. 2 thick folios, almost a daily record. And I wrote it very graphically because the scenes were graphic. She wore this kind of sari, or the room was like this. So that made writing the book a little easier. So that's what I felt it had to be put down, if only for myself. Otherwise, when I grew old, or older than I am now, I wouldn't believe that those things had happened.
So you're portraying, you're depicting a world that most of us in this room don't know about. We don't know what goes on. We have no idea. We live in this little bubble that we occupy the whole time. Do you think it's important, Ashok, that this separate parallel universe of fellow citizens is something that we don't know anything about?
I think it's absolutely important for us all to know about this. I am not talking about the world of sex work now. I'm talking about the other India now. I work now for the last several years with my own NGO. We work with maternal and child health in several states in northern India. And I might say something which is a little disturbing, but I believe it's true. I would rather be a sex worker than many women in some of the more challenged parts of northern India. And this is an India that I at least didn't know about, and if I might presume, most people in this audience wouldn't know about. So we continue with our lives with certain presumptions about things. We discuss inane things on TV and otherwise, and we don't know what's happening in our own country. We develop certain attitudes, therefore, that we pass on through generations and for ourselves. I mean, at the age of 50, as a guy who was professionally meant to advise people on India, I realized I was an idiot. I didn't know anything about my own country. I think it's absolutely important. If nothing else, today we have the worst mother and child health parameters among the bottom 10 or 15 countries in the world. And we're talking about rockets to the moon, we're talking about this or that, or GDP growth. Fix that, and if you're a smart guy, you'll see the correlation with GDP. It's absolutely important. People say, what can I do? First, educate yourself. There's a lot of stuff out there. Just read it. And you got me on something I feel a bit strongly
We'll
about.
come back in a bit to what you're doing at the moment, but...
But a bell might start ringing.
No. But
we will take a little extra time because I noticed the last group went a little bit over. So
tough negotiating skills, Ashok. But how has it altered you as a person? Because you've gone to go from the corporate world to go to sex workers and AIDS, and that whole entire journey. Has it altered you for the better?
I think it's altered me. And definitely it has to be for the better. But I think I realized what I didn't know. I think a lot of scales dropped from the eyes. I changed my lens. I developed one thing which I never had in McKinsey. I developed some humility to ask people who are less empowered what the answer is and the way forward. I developed, if I dare use the C word, I developed a little bit of compassion, which I never had. I think compassion, at least for me, was one of the most bandied about terms and the most pretentious word that people use. And what really is it? When I came back home sometimes and I realized that the boy I dealt with was dying of HIV, or the woman who couldn't buy the next meal because her child was sick, that kid was just the same age as my son, who was studying out in New York. And he was dying because he didn't have the money or his mother couldn't support him. I just broke down and cried in a way that I mean, when do men cry after all, right? That kind of thing. And I think it's a good thing. I think it's a cathartic thing for us, at least it was for me, to feel a range of emotions, to cry, to be so angry you never felt that way, to be so frustrated, to laugh your guts out. Sex workers are the funniest people in the world. And so I've tried to put it in the book. That's why I was a bit sensitive to people who say, how do you write a depressing book? It's meant to take the reader through a range of emotions, because that's a kind of soul washing that can happen.
Your son, when someone launches them into a new adventure, they can often find that the people in their life don't go along with them because it's something very, very risky and unknown. How did your social circle, your McKinsey colleagues, your family react to your decision to leave?
It's a peculiar thing when you do things like this, that people will always come and hug you and say you're doing God's work and so on. But how many people, if the people don't feel that way and they think you've been out in the sun a lot, they're not the ones who are going to tell you that, right? So I can say a lot of people said all those good things to me. I could also answer the question another way. Who cares? I mean, I really didn't, I had to do something. It had to be done. Nothing, no force in this universe could have stopped me from doing this. So I really didn't care. Of course, it's always good to have your wife behind you, and she was always solidly behind me. So that's how it worked.
And just, do any of the sex workers remember you? I mean, are you in touch with any of them? Have you been back to those places where
Can I tell a little story?
Of course.
The bell rang once, but I'll do it quickly. It's a story in the book, but I'll give it away. Not very years after I finished Avahan, and we shut down Avahan and handed it over to the government. I was in Pune and I had a flight to take. And this thought always kept in my mind, will the sex workers remember me? Something made me feel that I didn't want to be completely forgotten. So it's in Pune, the big red light area is called Budwarpet, but it's in the heart of the city, right next to Chitle Bandhu and all this red light area. So my flight, I still had a lot of time, so I asked the driver to take me to Budwarpet area. So firstly, he raised his eyebrows a little bit. I said, I'll be right back. I went up the stairs and there were the same women there, and they were so thrilled to see me. They told me they'd started their own beauty salon. They kind of sprayed me with some stuff because I didn't have time to stop. So I come down 1 hour later smelling of perfume. And the driver he just shook his head like this, and I don't know. So I think the sex workers remember me, that's for sure.
Just one last question before we open it up to the audience. Tell us a little bit more about the work you're doing at the moment, because it's in the field of...
So when I finished Avahan, the main thing we did in a public health sense is that we demonstrated how to scale a problem that was tough to scale. And so the idea came, can you use those methods of scaling, which essentially are business thinking, in maternal and child health, which is the biggest area of tragedy. So I'm working on maternal and child health. I have my own NGO, and we are a startup, desperately in need of funding if anyone's out there, but I won't. Working in Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, it's a different field.
That's great. Thank you, Ashok. Thanks very much. Any questions for Ashok? Where? I can't see. Oh, the lady over there? The microphone, please. In the third or fourth row.
Lights go off intentionally or what? I just suddenly can't see anyone.
Thank you very much for opening our eyes up to what you've experienced. You mentioned in passing the plight of the women in the northeastern part of the country. Would you like to share one or two of those with us?
Yeah, in fact, it should trouble all of us to know that, the HIV campaign was so successful that HIV prevalence in India is just a little bit better than it is in the United States. So, but in Manipur and Nagaland, HIV levels are still very, very high. And that's because injection drug use is a tough thing to contain. So the epidemic there was driven a lot more by IDU than by HIV. So I think that's the problem there, and it continues to be a problem. Ultimately, there's no easy solution to it. It will only come with economic development of that part of the country.
And there's no medical care.
I'm sorry?
And there is no medical care.
Medical care is a lot better in injection drug use and heroin. Substitution therapy or harm reduction package is what's important. The government of India actually on paper has some of the most far-reaching HIV prevention programs. But actually getting into those people, giving a kid who at the age of, like I said there, 14-year-old injecting drugs, how can you deal with something as calamitous as that? It's getting better, but it's well above the levels that it should be.
In the front row, please.
Can someone put on the light, because suddenly I can't see who's talking because the lights have been switched off or something in the audience.
Hello. Good evening, sir. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Arjun Bedi. I just want to know if this book is being translated into the many languages, because then the people who you've written about, they should, would be connected to the whole.
I think that's a very, very good idea. I hope the publishers will see fit to go in that direction. I was quite thrilled to see that there's a very well-known director who's interested in considering it for a film. I think audio has a lot of possibilities here. But I think this really, your point is that it should go to a much broader audience here around India, and translation will do a lot. Interesting, the second part of the book is set in Mysore, in one particular location, which still exists today. And there, the book is effectively been translated into Kannada because it's passed around so much.
Any other questions? The lady in the green?
Yes, actually we belong to a country where parents sex, which is a derogating topic right now. In reality, it is.
I think if you really want to do that, I would encourage you yourself to meet sex workers. It's a very easy thing to do. NGOs working that field can do that. So that you can talk to your family, friends and parents in a way that depicts it as an individual story. When you think of the sex worker as a mother, primarily, see what she does to get through the day and to live for her child, I think nobody will ever tell you sex workers are bad things. You would say these are the best mothers in the world, and they're showing a level of bravery that I wish we had. You start seeing it from a different way. But when you put a label of these are sex workers, they are bad people, then the kind of stigma that still prevails, the fact that this is not celebrated as an achievement, that comes about.
You know, it's not just the immediate family that sex workers are looking after. You'll find that it's a nephew who wants to do engineering at college. It's a niece who has to be married, and someone has to come up with the money.
Frankly, looking after each other. Remember, these women are cutthroat competitors, right? But when one of them falls sick or ill, you'll see them giving up their meager earnings so that that person can get treatment. I would see all kinds of things which were quite staggering.
Say in your book, sometimes it's a family emergency. Medical bills have to be paid. So it's a woman who is sent out, and she does sex work for a few months to earn enough money to pay off those bills or whatever the emergency was, and then goes back to being a housewife. I just squeeze in one question, last question, Ashok, is that do you think attitudes have changed at all from the kind of situation you describe where a young child, I think this was in Manipur, his mother and father have died of AIDS, he's given her to his grandmother. The grandmother also doesn't want to look after him because of the stigma. Do you think anything's changed between then and now?
Yes, I mean things have changed because HIV itself has become down to a minuscule amount in our society. So those kinds of situations don't happen. But I'm afraid I have a very sad view of our attitudes more generally in society to the lot of people who are not as well off. I think that we're increasingly a cruel society who cares far less than we should. Those things are not getting better. So it may not be in HIV, but certainly there in maternal and child health. Go to any village in India and you'll see it in northern India, and so on and so forth. That's my personal view. But I'm an optimist and I think things will get better. But things are getting worse right now.
Any comments on this or more questions? Yes.
I had a question. Look, because this is the second bed, still hasn't got, we have a little time. I was wondering if you would...
Sir, I can't hear you.
Second episode, because I wanted to ask you about an interesting episode that you encountered during your work, and you did mention one. But a second one maybe?
There was a second one, there are many, but I think that one I'm very proud of is when me and my colleague Hari were adopted as brothers of the transgender community in Coimbatore. And we went through this ceremony by which we were adopted. That was a moment of great pride for me.
What did the ceremony involve?
Yeah?
What did the ceremony involve?
if it's for public consumption.
No, it was in a room full of transgenders, but the way they do it, they invoke the names of all the gurus in their Gharana section. Transgenders, there are about 6 Gharanas in India, and we both sat on the floor, and their leader, Selvi, who had, I think I describe her as somebody with a hard stubble and greatly adamant breasts. She blessed us. We touched her feet and we went on our way. I really believe this, that the blessings of a transgender, the Hijra, as it's called Northern India, truly are a blessing. You really get something out of it. So, I think I got something out of it.
First of all, congratulations on what you're doing. Can I have the name of the NGO you have currently formed for the welfare of women and children?
It's called the Antara Foundation. And I have loads of cards in my pocket.
You planted her in the audience.
We are a stage 1 startup trying to get to a stage 2. We will talk offline.
Any more questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashok and Amrit, for writing about a subject that no one talks about, for talking about it, and thank you for the work that you do. Just before Amardeep goes on stage, a couple of announcements. Tomorrow morning we have Soul's Diet with Sufi